when you're weary and feeling small, when tears are in your eyes, I will dry them all. I'm on your side. Oh, when times are rough and friends just can't be found, like a bridge over troubled water, I will lay me down like a bridge over troubled water. I will lay me down. And pain is all around, like a bridge over troubled water. I will lay me down like a bridge over troubled water. I will lay me down, lay me down.
My philosophy is very simple. When you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, say something, do something, get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble.
I grew up in Baltimore. I'm the son of a single mother, which includes me, my two siblings, and I'm the only one to go to college. Growing up, my mom always told me that if there's an opportunity that I can take that I feel like will either benefit me or make me happy in some way, I should take it. Torch Scholarship was a big deal for my mom, but I think she was more worried than anything else because it meant that I could potentially be moving away. Torch allows me to focus on other things like my schoolwork, helping my peers. I don't have to focus on paying for housing or like where my next meal will come from, thankfully. As I sit and reflect on John Lewis's words, good trouble means to me just simply taking action that you believe will have a positive change. So the way to cause good trouble is not only to take action, but to have a group of people who are like-minded as you who also want to take action. Trouble can only really be caused by groups of people who want to do something. My major right now is psychology and health science. I chose both of those majors really because I want to be a doctor in the future. As I continue on my career path into graduate school and past that, I want to remain affiliated with these groups of people who want to cause good trouble. If I could help increase the rate of minorities getting into med school, and like minority doctors in some form, I would be really happy with that. My name is Tyreek Gaston, and I'm a believer in good trouble.
I want to thank President Ayoun for giving me the opportunity to share a few reflections about my good friend, the late Congressman John Lewis, as we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. I love John. He was an inspiration. He was just such a wonderful person. And you know, I'm one of the very few people that can say that I had the honor of sharing a jail cell with John Lewis. You know, a few years ago, he and I engaged in an act of civil disobedience. We were trying to call attention to the terrible human rights atrocities happening in Darfur, where there was a genocide unfolding. And we were trying to get more attention called to what the reality was there. And so we decided, after doing press conferences and letters to the administration and on, that we would go to the embassy and get arrested. And we did. And I spent many hours in a jail cell with John as he talked to me about his life and his experiences in the civil rights movement. What an inspiration. You know, when I first got elected to Congress, I remember approaching him and asking him for advice. You know, how do I be a good member of Congress? And he said, you got to go out there and be a troublemaker, but always make good trouble. And I've tried to do that. I mean, because, you know, that really is the calling for all of us. I mean, you see something that is wrong, you try to make it right. You see an injustice, you know, you fight for justice. That was his life, and that is something, quite frankly, that all of us should try to emulate. You know, I remember going with him on a few occasions on his annual civil rights pilgrimages, where we would go to various historic sites in the civil rights movement. They would always end with a march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. And one of the things that to this day has always struck me is that, you know, we would go and we would visit not only people who marched alongside of John during these historic marches, but also people who jailed him, people who beat him. When he marched over the Edmund Pettus Bridge for voting rights, he was almost killed. But the people who almost killed him, when we would see them, he would embrace them because he believed that life had to be about forgiveness, and that you know, we shouldn't carry hate in our heart. We should only carry love. And I always thought that was incredibly moving. He was not only a great man, but he was a very, very good man. My daughter Molly, who's a student at Northeastern University, as well as my son Patrick, who's a student at Northeastern University, I mean, a couple of years ago was doing a high school paper on music in the civil rights movement. And she asked me, like, you know, where do I go to research this? And I said, well, why don't you talk to John Lewis? And I remember she went and sat down with him and talked to him about music, and he sang songs to her that were sung during various marches and various gatherings, some which included Martin Luther King. But I remember one thing he said to her. He said to Molly, he said, music to the civil rights movement, it was incredibly important, inspirational, and motivating. He said, you know, you got to think of it that music in the civil rights movement without music is like a bird without wings. And I'll never forget that. But he sat down very patiently with my daughter and again, you know, mesmerized her with his life experiences. Look, you know, this is Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, and everybody likes to talk about, you know, the lessons of Martin Luther King's life. Well, here's my view. On this day, we have to stop just talking. We have to do more action. And there is so much that is confronting our country and our world that is so wrong right now. And it's not going to change unless all of us get up and, in the spirit of John Lewis, fight for justice, fight for what is right, fight for human rights, for human dignity. And there's not a day that goes by that I don't think of him. So anyway, I wish you all the very best.
Good afternoon. My name is Ted Landsmark. I am the director of the Kitty and Michael Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy at Northeastern. And we're gathered here today on Martin Luther King's Celebration Day to have a conversation on the subject of getting into good trouble. Our panelists, our speakers today, are Nicole Aljoe, who is a professor and head of our program in Africana Studies, Shalonda Baker, also a professor of public policy, and Hillary Robinson, who is a professor of law and sociology. I've been asked to facilitate this conversation, I think in part because I had the great privilege of being able to participate in some of the early stages of the civil rights movement. And in fact, as a college student, I marched in Selma, Alabama. I was not one of the marchers. I was one of the people in the background preparing sandwiches for the marchers. But from the time of my time in college, I've been involved with matters of civil rights and social justice. And I think that on this Martin Luther King Day, we are experiencing a level of discourse and turmoil around race and social justice in this country that is unprecedented, particularly given the events that took place in Washington. I want to open the conversation up to our three presenters, whom I will ask to present alphabetically. And my hope is that our conversation will not only inform, but inspire as we begin to talk about things that we as a university community can do to further the cause of social justice in the United States and abroad. And so I'm going to ask my colleague, Nicole Aljo, to open up with her comments. Nicole?
Great. Thanks so much, Ted. It's wonderful to be here this morning and looking forward to the conversation and the dialogue that will ensue with my colleagues. So I am Associate Professor of English and Africana Studies, and my own research focuses on mostly the slave narrative, so writings by and about enslaved Black people, mostly in the 18th and 19th century. And so for me, the connections for me with John Lewis's story are around this question of story and this question of narrative and the kinds of narratives that we choose to tell and the kinds of narratives that we find ourselves, kind of caught up in. And what I find particularly enlightening about Lewis's story is his engagement with this touchstone, right? This concept of good trouble. And, like a good, literary historian, good English person, I'm struck with the terminology, right? So good trouble, these are terms that are not supposed to, right, go together. But his story and his life has shown us the benefits, right, and the crucial importance of linking these two terms, good trouble, and that it is particularly important, especially at this time, right, in light of what just happened on Wednesday, to think more deeply about the relationship, right, of those two terms. What does it mean to be good, right, as an American, and what does it mean to trouble, right, the United States and infrastructures, right, of power? How can we bring these two terms into productive, right, or the most productive kinds of conversations?
Terrific, thank you, Shalonda.
Hi, Ted, and hi, dear colleagues, Nicole and Hillary. It's so great to be here together. At the beginning of what looks like it will be an interesting year and the tail end of a season that was itself quite challenging. So it's great to be together. I agree with Nicole that it's for me, it's interesting to look at John Lewis's life through the lens of my own work, because it's stuff that I've been sort of entrenched in and seeped in for so long. And my work is at the intersection of climate, energy, and social justice. And so, I think when people think about the civil rights movement, they often think about sort of the right to vote, the right to take up space in the public sphere. But in fact, structural racism and structural violence are part of so many of our systems, including the energy system. And, for me, this past year, so 2020, and then now coming into 2021, has really been an opportunity to reckon with all of the ways in which race is implicated throughout our various systems, even those systems we see as particularly technical in nature. And so I'm inspired by the work of John Lewis. I'm inspired by those who continue to march. I agree with Nicole that, you know, the idea of good trouble takes on a particular resonance right now. And, you know, one of the things that came up a lot last week, January 6th, was this idea that this is not who we are, which is patently untrue, right? And, you know, the original sin of this country was, you know, dispossession, death, colonization, you know, marked by the massacre of indigenous peoples, you know, and that paved the way as well for Africans, enslaved Africans, to come into this country. So that is who we are, and we really do have to reckon with that. I think, you know, I'm excited to hear from everyone as we continue this conversation, but, you know, for the young people who will be listening to this conversation, I think they also have to grapple with that and understand that the work is still there and that there's so much work that remains. So, and it remains, kind of going back to my initial point, across all domains and dimensions of our society. And so we really have to look into that. So I will stop my initial remarks there as well, and look forward to hearing from Hillary.
Hillary.
Tthank you very much, Ted. Hi to my colleagues, Shalanda and Nicole. It's so nice to see you. I, again, am delighted to participate in honoring the memories of both John Lewis and Martin Luther King, who we knew for a lifetime on this important day. And following my colleagues, I'll also try and link my comments about John Lewis and his work to some of the research that I'm doing in the domain of technology and law and labor struggle, something that Martin Luther King thought was intricately embedded in the struggle for civil rights in the United States, for reasons that Shalanda has gestured at, that the country was built on stolen land and stolen labor, the bodies of Black people brought from Africa, and that our current system of capitalism reflects the distribution of resources that was kind of set into place by those historical antecedents. And so, you know, the labor struggle and capitalism itself were, you know, part of what Martin Luther King and John Lewis wanted to scrutinize as they thought about the social distribution of rights by race. So to that end, I mean, one of the questions we have to ask about good trouble is, where do you cite the struggle? And, you know, we know that these historical images of John Lewis in Selma cite the struggle on a bridge. We saw, you know, devastating images of a kind of struggle that was cited in the U.S. Capitol. And so these decisions in John Lewis's individual biography about, you know, where to struggle and how to struggle, I think are really illustrative about, in regards to taking a difficult problem of civil rights and figuring out what to do about it. So Lewis grew up in the segregated South. His biographers indicate that he didn't know any, you know, white people because his family were sharecropping in a very rural and segregated area of Alabama. So until his teenage years, he wasn't, you know, living in an integrated society. Took a trip to Buffalo, New York with his father and saw what more integrated life looked like in the North. And you know, in the year that he met Martin Luther King, which was 1955, he preached his first sermon. So developing this kind of ability to speak about struggle to larger groups. He wrote to King later about having been denied admission to Troy University in Alabama. And there was a question here about where to cite the struggle. So would King's help, would he sue the university, which might bring problems for his family who were still living in Troy, Alabama at the time? John Lewis chose to attend instead Fisk, a historically Black college in the area, and there to start his involvement with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. From there, situating the struggle in the Freedom Rides, and then taking that struggle to Congress and ending in one of his first public appearances, standing on a painted segment of 16th Street in my hometown, Washington, D.C., saying that he was inspired and hopeful by the Black Lives Matter movement. Of course, this is Black Lives Matter Plaza, painted in front of the White House, in front of Lafayette Square, that, you know, in this op-ed that he wrote and published just before he died, that he was inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement and the way that that movement has situated the struggle in the 21st century.
Many people think of the civil rights movement as something that happened a long time ago. It's often treated as an artifact of American history. And yet, what we've seen since the beginning of this calendar year is that a struggle around racial justice and social justice continues to go on, and that there was an insurrection that took place at the United States Capitol, and that many of the people who were involved with that were speaking out against matters of racial justice in this country. Indeed, some people carried Confederate flags. And even within our own student body, which is largely international, many people have asked, well, why is this relevant to me at this moment? And so I would ask each of you to bring the civil rights movement and John Lewis's thoughts that we should try to make good trouble forward to 2021. What message do you think his work leaves for those of us, particularly in an academic environment, who are working with global students around engagement with issues of race and social justice?
I'll start. I think what stands out to me is the tenuousness of freedom and the tenuousness of democracy. That these are the civil rights movement, and even going back to the Civil War, and you know the Reconstruction period, it highlights the fact that freedom is not a given. That freedom is something that folks have to actively work towards, and work to ensure that it remains and that it's sustained, And I think that is, one of the overriding lessons of the civil rights movement from the beginnings, I would argue, of the interaction between European colonizers, and native peoples here. This idea that freedom is something that, the colonizers had, that, the natives did not, is something that we need to just continually remember. That's what stands out to me. Just the tenuousness, the fact that it can so easily, be taken away from us if we are not vigilant. And I think that is, for me, one of the overriding lessons from Lewis, that we need to be vigilant, as Hillary was saying, the various permutations that his own life has gone through in terms of the civil rights movement, So, his engagement activities with Martin Luther King, moving over to SNCC, moving to work with Jimmy Carter in the White House, then moving to elected office, that kind of thing. But it's never doing the same thing, the same idea, of freedom, civil rights, access, social justice, but different tools and different activities are required to sustain and animate, this movement for freedom.
Just jump in there, and this has been such a challenging week, or several days, and I've been reading a lot and just sort of reflecting a lot on where we are. This idea of American exceptionalism has come up again and again, and the disruption of that concept has been, kind of become evident, We are not exceptional and extraordinary and immune from the type of disruption that we've seen in other places, particularly places where terrorist cells thrive. And what we witnessed was domestic terrorism last week. And I think, one of the beautiful moments of the summer of 2020 was this sort of solidarity that we saw in places like France, in, Latin America, where folks were flooding into the streets to march in solidarity for the rights of people of color to be in the public sphere without fear for their lives. And so I think for me, there's no message really for our international students or the counterparts other than, we are in this together, right? America has sort of been this beacon of democracy, but when you dig beneath that, again, it's a deeply troubled place, not just a history. And so for me, it's a message of ongoing solidarity. It's a message of, white supremacy is something that impacts us all, no matter where we live. And the legacy of colonialism, the legacy of imperialism, it infects every aspect of the globe and every corner of the globe. So that may be somewhat hopeful, right? That we can at least come together around a unified theme.
Many of our students are going to move into private sector jobs, either as independent entrepreneurs or working for large multinational corporations. When we speak of Dr. King or John Lewis, they worked largely in the public sector. When one goes into the private sector, particularly into technology and the like, artificial intelligence, what would your hopes be that our graduates would take away from their experience over the last few weeks and at Northeastern about their roles in private sector environments, or even in their own families, about moving forward with discussions and action concerning social justice?
I can make some comments about this that are also responsive to the previous point that Shalanda was making. I think one of the reasons that Black Lives Matter as a movement was inspirational coming from the United States to the rest of the world is because racism is not an American problem. It's not, it has political manifestations, but it's not a political question. It's a human rights question. And we see this distribution by color of skin across so many different countries that, in the law, when I think about people like John Lewis, Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, both of whom had legal training and ran legal practices before they entered, the public arena for social justice, there was a recognition there that under color of law, these distributions have been produced. So there's a relationship between, what we see writ large across the society and what's happening in the public sector. So, the Third Reich, for example, was a highly legalistic regime before it proceeded to outright murder, right? Ghettoization happened under statutory law. And similarly, Jim Crow, a highly legalistic regime for the separation of people based on race. Apartheid in the 90s in South Africa, the same thing. So, being able to recognize that what we as Americans experience and what Martin Luther King and John Lewis experienced was this particular color line that Du Bois talked about, that Baldwin spoke about, that comes out of our particular historical story with race and with forced migration of peoples from Africa and removal of native people from land here in the United States, that yet there is a strong analogy between that story and other racial distributions that we see across the world. The movement towards corporate social responsibility is one that takes into account the role of how people are socialized at work, not just the progression of an individual up through the levels, for example, from a line level employee to the corporate suite, but also given that we spend so much of our lives at work, who we work with and how workplace dynamics are assembled are important for people's experience of living in the world. That's another point. And a third would be, I teach a class in sociology called the 21st Century Workplace, and it counts for a requirement in both computer science and engineering. So I have at least half of the class full of the designers of artifacts. And one of the things that I teach them is that technology is really not neutral, because it's linked on both ends to the design functions that will, foreclose certain possibilities and open up other possibilities, and how it's used, how it's deployed in the world and then taken up by a set of users. So for people like that to understand that there isn't this hard separation between kind of things that we think of as cultural and things that we think of as technical or scientific, that they're in a network together with individuals who are culturally situated, no matter what your chosen profession is. You are, embedded or submerged in culture, which is this thing that is, we are porous to it, and it is around us at all times. So, those are the contributions that I try and make, knowing that many of my students will not work in public policy, that, as you were indicating, Ted, they'll go to the private sector, and in many cases, work in domains that don't seem like they're cultural.
Many of our students took advantage of opportunities to participate in Black Lives Matter activities over the course of the past year. And a great many of them were involved in voter registration and voter turnout drives around the country. In fact, we set a record for ourselves in terms of the number of people who were registered and who participated even in voting that took place for the first time in many years on our campus. What are the things that we need to be thinking about that represent the act of making good trouble in 2021?
John Lewis had made alliances and coalitions, SNCC is a good example, across the spectrum of racial divisions that we have in this society. It's so important to work together, in addition to having strong solidaristic organizations of people of color.
For me, I've seen a lot of students on campus engaged in good trouble. I think that our students are, it seems to me at least, pretty comfortable with when they see something wrong. At least some of them, right, will speak up about it and challenge the situation in some way, shape, or form.
I am so heartened by the way that students and young people and this generation have stepped up, right? This is their moment. This is, they're fighting for their future. They're fighting for a more just future for the next generations. We can only do so much. And, we are facing historic, unprecedented challenges, and we can't overstate that. Climate change, this pandemic, this renewed sort of awareness of the structural racism in our society. These are historic moments. So this is an opportunity for transformation. And I have so much hope that they will do that. And in closing, I would say that, Martin Luther King's idea, his hope, the promise that he believed in for this society was all about light. We are in such a dark period, but light will always triumph. It may take a while. But I do believe that we'll get there. And so I am giving it all. I'm sort of hoping that our students will take on that charge and shine their own light around the world.
Universities have for nearly 1,000 years been the centers of seeking truth through research, through dialogue, through discourse, through publications. And if there was ever a moment where American democracy needed to have a light shone on truth, it is that moment now, today, on this celebration of Martin Luther King's work. This is clearly a time when our own school motto, which speaks to truth and light, our insignia, which speaks to seeking and speaking the truth to a wider world, is essential and has never been needed more.
That last Latin word in the motto is virtus, which can be interpreted as courage. I think, both Martin Luther King and John Lewis would get behind that one.
I want to thank the three of you, in part because of your comments, but in part because your peers, your faculty who are bringing light and truth and a sense of social justice to our campus and to our adjoining communities here in Boston and around the world. And on this day in particular, where we look to the words of John Lewis to go out, seek truth, and to make good trouble in the world. I'm delighted to have you as faculty peers and as colleagues who are working together with our entire community to celebrate today, but more importantly, to celebrate the hope that now exists in our country that we'll be able to effectively address issues of social justice. Thank you all, and I hope that today is a day of learning from the words of John Lewis and Dr. Martin Luther King.
Thank you all for being here today. Thank you for your contributions, your remarks, your singing, and I would like to reflect with you on what happened in 2020. And here I'm not talking about COVID-19. Black Lives Matter was a wake-up call for society at large that ignored systemic racism. But it was also a wake-up call for our community. It caught us as a university by surprise, flat-footed. And since then, we mobilized ourselves in order to make sure that moving forward, we will build a community that is more diverse, intolerant of any racism or discrimination. And we are working at it all together. This day, we are celebrating Dr. King's birthday. Dr. King said, "We made of the world a neighborhood, but we failed to make it a brotherhood or a sisterhood." That's what we are seeking to do at Northeastern. It's going to take a lot of effort. We are remembering and celebrating John Lewis's life and mission. He exhorted us to be good troublemakers in order to build a society without racism, without discrimination, wherever it was, whether it is in Darfur or in our own communities here. This call is universal. I would like to thank my good friend, Congressman Jim McGovern, parent of 2 children here at Northeastern. I also would like to thank Damien, Tyreek, Ted, Shalonda, Hillary, and Nicole. I also would like to thank Dr. O'Brien for his leadership, the members of the O'Brien Institute, and the MLK Fellows. Thank you for all your work, and thank you for your leadership. Our community here at Northeastern is inspired by John Lewis's words. His legacy is lasting and inspiring the future generations that are being educated at Northeastern.